quite whether we end up in a more or less dangerous position if America suddenly withdrew in its entirety, my suspicion would be considerably more dangerous.
I very much hope and believe that the British people will convincingly decide that their future lies in Europe. It doesn't lie as the 51st state of the United States of America, which is in any case looking more and more in the other direction.
Europe would be, I think, the worse off if America does retreat, with the very, very good reasons it's got to retreat, not just the experience of Iraq and Afghanistan.
Well, thank you all very much for coming to what I hope will be a really fun and interesting session. George was saying just now it ought to have been fears of the Europeans, not tears of the Europeans. We've exchanged tears for fears, which is a joke that will only work on any of you over 30, probably.
40, I think.
40, oh, whoops. But what this debate is all about is how nervous and insecure, or indeed how happy, Europe should be now that the US seems to have more or less withdrawn from public life to spend more time with its family. It's becoming a much less unipolar world. Is this something we should welcome, or is it something that should worry us? That's what we're going to be talking about. The format is that each of our three guests is going to do a short 3-minute pitch of what they think, and we're then going to open it up for discussion, and finally, plenty of time for Q&A at the end. Let me introduce them in turn now. Phil Collins here on my right is a very good political columnist on The Times. He was also chief leader writer there until recently. And before that, he wrote speeches for George's great friend, Tony Blair. He's also a visiting fellow at LSE and associate editor at Prospect, which Bronwen Maddox edits. She also used to be at The Times, actually, as a foreign editor and chief foreign commentator. And George Galloway needs little introduction. Until recently, Respect MP for Bradford West. He described his 2012 return to office as the most sensational victory in British history. How do you describe May the 7th, or don't I ask? Right, so we're going to start with Phil. You make your pitch.
Well, to the extent that America is retreating from public life, and to some extent it is, I don't regard that as necessarily a good thing for Europe. There is no country and no power bloc which has ever been the repository of either good or evil in essence, and there are many things on which America has got wrong, and no doubt we'll go through some of them. I'd imagine we'll all agree on them, but they don't define the essence of America, and we may well look back 100 years hence, those of us who are still here, and think that this was an era in which American power was at least as often benign as it was malign. The European project is, of course, a point of real crisis, a strange departure to a single currency, which even at the time looked a rather peculiar institutional avenue to explore, has brought the European economies to their knees, and the very idea of Europe is now in question. Whereas Europe was once a magnet for countries, and Europe was the answer to a very real question, which was how do we rebuild a continent after a terrible conflict? That memory has faded, and Europe has struggled to find a purpose. It, in a sense, a victim of success. It did exactly what it was designed for, and then subsequently has struggled to find a way to define itself, and has sought refuge in a series of institutional changes, such as a constitution and a currency, and it's led it to the impasse it's currently in. Of course, that goes hand in hand with economic decline. And diplomatic and cultural power always trails an economic position too. And we look across the world and we see the rise of China and we see the rise of India. And we have there an extraordinarily interesting experiment in different models of development. On the one hand, you have the raucous, vibrant democracy of India, chaotic and yet rather argumentative and marvelous. But economically, still not wildly successful, though growing more rapidly than China for the first time in a long time. And then you have the authoritarian capitalist model of China. And you have the massive investment across the world in Africa and in South America that is China's contribution to its diplomatic enterprise. And that competition between those two countries strikes me as a fascinating laboratory experiment in political systems. Meanwhile, we sit here cowering, looking at this massive monolith on one side, the United States, and at India and China on the other, and we begin to wonder where's our economic future. So I do think we have a lot to be fearful about, and I think in that endeavor, over time, the countries with whom we share a language, a culture, and a tradition of liberal democracy will be friends of ours far more often than they are enemies of ours.
Well, I don't agree with the premise, but that's my job. I don't accept that the United States has anything like withdrawn from public life. It's heavily engaged in Europe, in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, in the front line at the Ukraine. It's bombing and coordinating bombing in many other parts of the world. If that's the United States as an isolationist power, I'd hate to see them if they got onto the front foot. Neither do I accept Phil's apparent thesis at the end there that we are somehow alien to Europe because we don't speak the same language as them. And I don't think that's widely shared amongst the British people, particularly
I didn't really mean to say that. No, I meant to fold Europe and America in together.
Okay. I thought when you mentioned the common language which divides us, otherwise, my apologies. And I don't accept the idea that Europe is somehow a basket case. London, Paris, Madrid, Rome, Berlin are a pretty wonderful chain of civilizations and places and peoples, and of course the other European capitals too. Far from running away from Europe, most people in the world on the move at the minute are trying to get into Europe. Of course, Europe has major problems, but the foremost amongst them is not the fact that Uncle Sam might be less prevalent in our affairs than he was previously. Phil rightly adumbrates the challenges to the economy and the currency and so on. But I believe that they will be overcome. And we'll have an early test of how the British people feel about that, of course. It was to be in 2017, might now be in 2016, might be as early as May or June of 2016. And I very much hope and believe that the British people will convincingly decide that their future lies in Europe. It doesn't lie as the 51st state of the United States of America, which is in any case looking more and more in the other direction. Neither does it lie in glorious isolation. So I see no need for tears or fears. The odd scrunching up of the eyes, the odd grimace maybe, but neither tears nor fears. I believe in Europe. I believe that we are a European people, and I believe that the more convincingly and sooner that we make that decision, that if you like, defining decision, future defining decision, the better.
Well, if I was forced to give a one-word answer to this question, I would say yes, better for us to be with America than against it. But it's the kind of question that has so many things packed into it. Yes, the US is a superpower, but actually in parts of the world that are challenging what you might call Western liberal values, and China may be one of those, and parts of the Middle East another, the US can barely use those attributes of being a superpower, certainly not to any sure success. And I agree with Phil that it's not really wanting to extend a wing to let anyone shelter under it. It is pulling back. Really, its mood at the moment is we want to go back home from all these trouble spots. There are trouble spots, and they're affecting Europe as well as Europe's own problems. You might list some of those as Russia, China, and parts of the Middle East, as parts of the world setting out to challenge, not just to have individual fights, but to challenge the West and to challenge the idea of a rule-governed world, of the kind that many countries, whether or not they've liked America or liked Europe, have broadly tried to sign up to since the Second World War. Now, China, to my mind, is actually one of the hardest of those. The country under its present leadership are setting out very assertively to say that the South China Sea, that marvelous melting pot of all kinds of countries for thousands of years, well, actually, that's something of a Chinese lake. But that is more of America's problem to take on and the countries around there. It's not close to us here in Europe. The two that are, Russia, to my view, is not the biggest problem, but it depends a lot on how we handle it now. And there we could be helped a lot by the United States. And the Middle East, an awful, painful, tragic mess as we can see every day at the moment. And there are very, very different views about whether or not America's action there is a plus or a big minus. My belief is it's been both. But one of the things that the Obama administration is doing that I think is really important and that Europe has really helped with is the Iran deal. Not a perfect deal, but if it happens, a really important step in trying to bring some kind of stability. So that's an example of where Europe is working with America, not under its wing, but pushing very hard to achieve some kind of diplomatic result. And I think that's very much for the better. To just end with a kind of coda of the American reluctance, American kind of fits of engagement with the world and then pulling back. There's been an ebb and flow pretty much since the United States was created. And at points of its expansionist points, people have recoiled and said, get out of here, here is the great trampling power. And at points when it's retreated, people have been tugging on its sleeve or wing, if you like to use the metaphor of the title, and said, won't you come back? Well, I don't think we're in as supplicant a position as that. But Europe would be, I think, the worse off if America does retreat, with the very, very good reasons it's got to retreat. Not just the experience of Iraq and Afghanistan, but the huge increase of population that it's got, the complexity of politics that brings, the passions and interests to the East. We have to keep giving them a reason to be involved in our interests, in our concerns. And the reason is that I think the one that Phil gave. We share at heart common interests, common values. Yes, many, many differences, but common values, which in the end we want to defend and see established. Thank you.
So let's start with I suppose the core question, which is a world in which the US is less assertive a more dangerous world or actually a better world? I'll start with you, Phil.
Well, it's very hard to answer that because in a way, we've tried everything over the last few years. We tried the process of intervention, which was calamitous in its consequence. And just now in Syria, we're seeing the process of inaction, which is also calamitous for a set of different reasons. In neither case can we run through the counterfactual and see what would have happened had we taken the other course. So it's very difficult. We tried in Libya somewhere, some intermediate point between the two with a limited engagement, which is also calamitous in its consequences. Yeah. So it's extraordinarily difficult. There's the great line that one of the Americans once said about the neoconservatives was they're nowhere near conservative enough. That sort of hubris of action. But I'm also conscious of the fact that if we don't act, then there are very dangerous things too. So quite whether we end up in a more or less dangerous position if America suddenly withdrew in its entirety, my suspicion will be considerably more dangerous, which is not to say America's perfect, but for the reasons Bronwen gave, that there are attempts to restrain and withhold, which I think are valuable. So if I had to give a simple answer to that very, very difficult question, I think it would become more dangerous if America withdrew from the world.
George?
Well, I don't recognize this rules-governed world that Bronwen talked about. And Phil just ran through some of the calamities as he put them. I have the advantage of having predicted that they would be calamitous in advance when our friends were telling us they were the right thing to do.
Did you predict that non-intervention in Syria would be calamitous?
Yes. I predicted that the failure to support Kofi Annan's political transition plan when he was the UN special envoy to Syria was going to prove calamitous. So yes, I did. Now, the idea that the countries, collection of countries, ourselves and the United States in particular, that illegally invaded and occupied Iraq and sent Al-Qaeda and ISIS cascading throughout the region and the world are somehow a representative of a rules-governed world is ludicrous. And it shows the extent to which right-wing commentators see the mote in the eye of the other, but not the beam in their own eye. Russia and China are being described here as on the verge of lawless. But it's we who are the lawless powers, not Russia or China. Bronwen, I think, may have been Marianne, said that the China
We're indistinguishable.
No, well, you're all at the Times and you're all at Prospect.
I'm not at the Times. I haven't been there for 8
you're
years.
You're not indistinguishable. You're fine, upstanding examples of individuality. But you all share...
I'm indistinguishable from you as well, apparently.
Yes.
Well, you all share a common worldview. I'm the only one here who's never worked at the Times or for Prospect.
I don't think it's likely either, George.
I haven't worked for Prospect, actually. Well, never mind.
You too?
I haven't worked for Prospect, no.
No, but you worked for the Times.
Yeah.
If you analyse the point I made, it's absolutely accurate. I'm the only person here who's neither worked at the Times nor Prospect.
Get over
yes,
it.
I would if I wasn't being heckled.
You're not being heckled. You're not being heckled.
It was described as China's monumental aggressiveness in imagining that the South China Sea was its orbit. The clue is in the name.
No, it isn't. It isn't. There are 5 different names for the sea.
China Sea. The one group of people who have no
Japanese
rights of any
Japanese
kind
Sea.
in the South China Sea are Britain and the United States. If the Russian and Chinese navies were at play out at the North Sea, just a few miles from here, I don't think we'd be sanguine about it. You see my point?
The
double
worries. No, I
standard?
don't see your Russian jets
No, I don't see your
flying around the channel.
Yes, but the Chinese Navy is not in the North Sea, but the American Navy is in the South China Sea. It's this double standard.
It's international waters.
Well, the North Sea,
shared by
the
7
North Sea
countries.
is also international waters. But you wouldn't be sanguine if the People's Liberation Armed Forces were at play in the North Sea, because you have double standards. You imagine that the world is a white man's burden and that we are somehow given by God or someone else to order the world. And I reject that view. I'm sorry. I just do. I know that's an unorthodox view on this platform, but it's mine.
All right, but let me ask you. You said, sorry, Mary, look, you said Russia is you don't recognize it as a lawless thing. Well, look, it's taken over Crimea and it's marched into Ukraine.
It hasn't marched into Ukraine, and you know
all right,
it.
No, I don't. No, I don't.
There are
no
Russian armed forces in Ukraine.
Oh, all right.
Of course there are.
Can you show me a picture of them? With all your journalistic talent here, can you show me a single picture of Russian armed forces in Ukraine? It has backed.
Yes.
She's now changed. She's now redefined it. It has backed. Yes, it has backed. As Britain and the United States are backing the rebels in Syria. People back others. It's not the same as asserting that the Russians are in the Ukraine. They're not.
Let Bronwen answer, George.
George, I don't think that parallel works at all. And President Putin's arguments that he's simply doing that to hold at bay the colonialist enterprise of the European Union and European Union, he says, which has to keep moving eastward and keep sustaining itself by swallowing up more countries. Yes, he does say that, and indeed has said it to me. This is a fantasy that Russia is putting out there. You won't deny that it has taken over Crimea.
The Crimea was an autonomous republic.
It was not. It was part of Ukraine.
Hugely populated by Russian people who were threatened by the right-wing Ukrainian nationalist coup d'etat in Kiev, which burned the parliament, overthrew the elected president, and appointed itself as power. You see, you just don't want to see these things. You want, look, if Russia behaved in as lawless a way as the United States and Britain have behaved over the last 20 years, the world would be entirely in flames. But you don't see that. You still think of yourselves as part of a group of law-governed people, and you're just not.
Look, Phil, I mean, there's a good argument for saying that the invasion of Iraq was illegal.
And there's a good argument for saying it wasn't illegal. I mean, I'm not. Well, there is. I mean, in strictly speaking, well, yes, but he's not the jurisdiction either. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer whether it was legal or not. The Attorney General ruled that it was a legal conflict. So insofar as we have a legal conflict, so insofar as we have a judgment, it was a legal conflict. There have been plenty of conflicts before where we think they have a strong moral imperative that would have been deemed to be illegal. So whether or not that has become the thing on which we rest, and no, we will never ever come to any kind of settled view on that. People are ensconced in their views, and in a sense it's a pointless discussion to go back through. The question is that even if you concede that it was of dubious legality, the notion that the United States and Britain are serially lawless, and on the one hand, and that Russia is some sort of great moral repository of legal obligation is preposterous. I mean, absolutely
Phil,
preposterous.
who said that?
As a general rule, when you're on a platform and an audience laughs at your point, you realize you've gone somewhere very peculiar. And you went somewhere very peculiar.
Well, actually, the audience didn't laugh.
Yes, they
Some
did.
of the audience laughed, and some of the audience agree with me. But this is not a tyranny of who laughs and who doesn't. We're analysing each other's
It's a
arguments.
democracy.
I mean, we could all have laughed at your assertion that the Iraq war was legal. You're the last man standing saying that it was legal.
I didn't say it was legal.
You're the last man
say
standing saying that it was legal.
Well, I'm not.
But that's
even
not,
if I were, I wouldn't be, as it happens.
that isn't the point.
Quite.
The
Which was my point.
The United States massacred millions of people in the lifetime, millions of people in the lifetime of many of the people here in Vietnam, and caused the massacre of millions more in Cambodia. Yet you parade the United States as some kind of lawful, benign force. Well, that's not how it looks from...
It's not how it sounds either.
Well,
both of
is
us
it
were
true
quite
or
careful.
not?
Well, both
Did
of us.
the United States bomb Vietnam?
Be quiet, and I'll tell you.
Let Phil answer.
It's very assertive of you, Phil.
Both of us were very clear in our remarks to say at the beginning that we do not regard the United States of America as some sort of caricature example of perfect goodness. We both were very clear that no country is in that position, and that though there are on both sides, there are things which the United States have done of which anyone would be proud, and things of which you would not. Now, it is not good enough for you to then pretend that our view of the United States is some sort of cartoon in which everything is rosy and gorgeous. Nobody thinks that. Nobody thinks anything so fundamentally and obviously stupid.
Will you be quiet now?
Okay, let's just cut the insults and then give you all a chance to speak. Actually, it's probably Bronwen's turn.
Oh, well, I was just going to pick up on the South China Sea thing.
Yeah,
Look,
go on.
that is a kind of colonial English term. There are about 7 different names, all in the languages of the countries around there for that sea, but none of them attribute it to China. China, decades ago, did something which is called the 9-dash line, and draw on a map 9 dashes enclosing most of that sea, which has been one of the most kind of richest cultural exchanges of the world. And kind of marked it for itself, along with the hundreds of islands, some of which it's now disputing, and others which it's now building artificial new islands. No other country around those borders claims essentially the whole thing for itself. And it's wrong of you to pick in English on the one word China and say that this designates it.
It was you that
because
called it
that is the most. Everyone has debated over the years.
We're clear about
What are we
that.
going to call
It was
this
you that
patch of
called it
warmer?
that.
Yes, it was, but you just simply picking up on the one word China and saying we must, because of that one word China, in a 50-year-old term loosely washed through the United Nations, we're going to give it to China on that basis that the word China occurs in its name is ludicrous. This is international territory, and which is China's action distressing all those countries around there.
Sure, but that's a matter for them. That's a matter for China and the people around about the sea to resolve. It's nothing to do with you. It's nothing to do with
Well,
the
actually,
United States of America.
George, to be fair to Bronwen, she did say earlier on, it's not something that should concern Britain or Europe. There is a question about whether it should concern the US.
She said it concerns the US.
Yes, I think it does.
How does it concern
well,
the US?
Apart from anything else, from a defence pact, a close defence pact with Japan that goes back to the end of the Second World War, which is fundamental to Japan's stance of not building up a military
so we're into the
of
world
its own.
of defence pacts. So defence pacts have nothing to do with right or wrong, legal, not legal, moral, not moral. They're defence pacts.
Well, they
now,
sort of do, because
Russia,
they're about securing the peace
exactly,
at the end of a conflict.
Japan at the end of the war, you can't rebuild your military. That was both a moral and a practical thing, given how threatening Japan had been during the war, and that in return, the quid pro quo was that they could shelter under the US military umbrella.
I don't think Japan had much choice in that arrangement, but what happened was the United States based a huge United States military force there, including nuclear weapons. They did not do so to stop any lurch backwards to revanchism amongst the Japanese people. They did so for their own self-interest as the world dominant power. Now, what my two friends are really crying about, if we're talking about tears, is that they're no longer top dog. China is already a bigger economy than the United States. The day is coming, and very soon, when no one in the world will tell China what to do. That's what they're really crying about, because they preferred it when Uncle Sam and John Bull could order the world as they pleased.
No, we haven't
now, luckily, this is on video.
George, we haven't said that at all.
No, but
and it's a point that Marianne is coming on to.
Well, that's my interpretation of why you're really crying.
No, my view of multipolar world is much better. It reflects the development of many countries finding their voice, finding the way to express themselves on the world stage, finding the way to assert their rights. It's much better for the world and for many millions of the people in it. I don't think the world where America could have its own way ever really existed. It is a bit of a caricature, but I think the world is better this way. I said right at the beginning, even though America is still a superpower, pretty well by anyone's definition, in the parts of the world where it is being challenged, China and the Middle East, actually that power, and America knows this perfectly well, that power may not account for very much. It can't take on China. It does not want a war with China. It has held back from intervention in the Middle East and is really very tentative about what to do there. So America is not behaving like a superpower that is trampling all over the world, or as if it expects to have any success from doing so. So I think that's a caricature, past and present.
Okay, can we just park the US for a minute now and look at the current state of the world and whether Europe does face dangerous threats? Should we be worried about China? Should we be perhaps more worried about Putin's Russia? Is the Middle East a threat to Britain and Europe, or just only in its own region? Can we talk about that and just forget America for now? Phil?
Well, yes, Europe faces problems. I don't fear China. I very much agree with what Bronwen just said about the multipolar world in which America is one voice amongst many. I don't think anybody either thinks it's feasible that America would be the dominant power or thinks it's especially desirable. But Europe faces a whole series of problems within its own borders, as well as those from outside. It faces the serious question of how it earns its living in the world. And I don't think we have any real answer to that question. Europe is struggling to find an economic purpose and an economic future for itself, and a lot of its other problems derive from that. Now, the idea that Europe is going to be a major part of any foreign adventures in a period of deep economic decline, I think, is very unlikely indeed. So its principal problems derive internally of trying to work out how on earth we make this economic union work for the people who are living in it.
George? Do you think we face threats? I'm thinking actually more about external threats.
I agree with Phil that the principal problem facing the 350 or 400 millions of us in the European continent is how to order our own affairs, how to get our own economies back onto their feet, to find, as Phil put it, a role for ourselves, what we actually are going to do to earn our living, in his words. These are very big and very worthy topics for our attention. And it's my point that we should be fretting less about others and making sure that our own house is in order. Now, I alluded to it earlier. I think, and I've traveled the world, not as much as Bronwen, maybe as much as Phil, I think Europe is the best place to live in the world today, for all its problems, in terms of its social peace, lack of crime relatively, the civilization, the ancient and collected civilizations that it represents. It's actually a beacon, a haven. It's a wonderful place to be by comparison with most other places in the world. That's quite a good start. And the sooner Britain plays a full and engaged role in that, the better it will be for us and for Europe. The Middle East is a total catastrophe. Everything that could have been done wrong has been done wrong. From the Sykes-Picot fake artificial division of the Arab countries, double dealing as usual, at the end of the First World War, to the buttressing of tyranny throughout the intervening period, through, in one case, supporting Islamist fanaticism in one country, but opposing it in another country, and supporting it again in a third country, opposing it in a fourth. Our policy is a total catastrophe. And Libya is a very good case in point. Gaddafi was probably the worst, the most crazed of all the Arab leaders. Phil's ex-boss thought he could do business with him and did quite successfully.
Didn't you buttress tyranny by supporting Saddam Hussein?
No, I'll come to Saddam Hussein if you would like. If
Yes.
they hadn't,
Yes, please.
Yes,
Yes, please.
If they hadn't overthrown Saddam Hussein, there would be no ISIS and there would be no Al-Qaeda cascading around the world.
There was
That's the fact.
9/11 was
That's the fact.
before the Iraq
That's
War.
the fact. There would be no ISIS in Iraq. There would be no ISIS in Syria. Now ISIS control 1/3 of each country. But don't let him off the hook with Libya. His former boss,
me.
yes, your former boss was the best of friends with Gaddafi. I've never met Gaddafi or any member of his grisly family, unlike Mr. Blair. I'm not blaming Phil for that. He was only the hired hand. But my point is,
I wasn't even there as it happened.
Gaddafi was a disaster. Gaddafi was a disaster. It takes real genius to make Libya 10, 50, 100 times worse after Gaddafi than it was under Gaddafi.
You're implying that we've got control, that the decisions actually made it. Well, look, there are no good decisions in many. There are no good decisions in some of these.
But you keep making the worst decisions.
You can't.
And then you come along here, hair and wide, and expect everyone to forget about it.
All right, I'll put one to you. Look, the United States at the moment, sorry, forgive me for mentioning it again, does it back Saudi Arabia or does it not? Either way, absolutely horrible decision. Backing Saudi Arabia, a very problematic regime confounding all its values. On the other hand, if Saudi Arabia blows up, even worse. You can call it, in retrospect, you're going to be able to call whatever it does probably the worst decision. It is not a region where there are good decisions at the moment. The question is just what can we do to improve it? And it seems to me this is Europe's problem. We can't detach. I completely agree with what you both said about Europe's problems at the moment being about how to organize itself and how to give itself a sense of identity and how to do things, make things that actually are going to raise productivity and wages in the years to come. And Europe's still struggling to recover from the kind of globalization that has hit it, and it hasn't got an answer to that. And even the next week, we don't know if it's got an answer to the Eurozone problems. But all that. The Russia question, as I said, I think is a threat, but not the biggest one. I think the Middle East, however much a mess, whatever the record of bad decisions, we are where we are. Europe, through many countries, Italy, France, Britain, intimately connected to those countries, and we can't cut ourselves off from them, even if we wanted to. And I think we really do have to try and make decisions about what we can do at these points. Libya could possibly still be open to some kind of diplomacy, fanciful as it sounds, because it's the only possible way you could see of trying, however black it seems, trying to bring some kind of peace to that is to get the 3 or 4 bits of the country that it's now broken into to talk to each other. It may be fanciful, but the alternative is worse. Yemen, possibly, we can help. The alternative is to sit back and let them all fight, and I don't think that's something that we want to do.
George, do you think that Putin has felt emboldened by America's not quite withdrawal from public life, but Obama clearly didn't want to get involved in any more military conflicts? I mean, I get the sense that Putin thought, great, now no one's going to oppose me in Ukraine.
But the United States is wholly engaged in Ukraine on Russia's front line. Victoria Nuland, former ambassador, now at the State Department, told us of the billions of dollars that she spent subverting the power in the Ukraine. John McCain and all the other neocon hawks were never off the streets. And the coup that took place in the Maidan, 18 months ago, is the cause of the confrontation between us and Russia. I don't see that Putin has done anything wrong anywhere else. He frustrated Western policy in Syria. That's true, but that wasn't wrong. I don't see where this charge sheet against Putin is drawn up from. Now, Russia is a capitalist country with an Russia's a normal capitalist country.
Run by a kleptocracy.
It is run by a kleptocracy, but not quite as kleptocratic as the Yeltsin era, which was, of course, hailed by right-wing people in Britain as some kind of golden era. The reason Putin is popular in Russia is because he's taking some of the wealth back from the kleptocrats. Now,
to himself.
I don't think it's to himself. I don't see where you're a respected journalist. I don't know why you would make such an assertion on tape without the remotest piece of evidence to support it.
You're saying he's not corrupt?
I'm saying that he is not taking money for himself. Where's the evidence? Give me your evidence that Putin is stealing money for himself.
I didn't say that. I
you
absolutely
did say it.
No, you're talking about,
you said for
the power
himself.
and control. Yes, but I'm talking about the power and control of a lot of the key companies and around.
Bronwen, you said for himself. I'm sorry.
Yes, I did, but I didn't say he's stealing money for himself. We're now getting into splinters of sentences.
Well, perhaps.
That he is rewriting
he's giving Russia back some of its perceived national dignity that it lost under Yeltsin. Well, you can laugh if you like, but that's how Russians see it. Now, my point is...
That's why there are protests in the streets in the past few weeks.
Well, there are protests in every street, Bronwen. There are protests in London. But that doesn't mean that the majority of Russians don't support Putin. My point is, I don't know why you needed to have a confrontation with Putin. He's not my man. He's your man. I'm a leftist. He's not. If I could choose the government of Russia, it wouldn't be Putin. He's a man that thinks like you. He believes in capitalism, free markets, national states. I don't know why you needed to fall out with him. That's my point. China's a different kettle of fish. It has a different ideology, but Russia doesn't.
Phil, do you want to go in?
Sometimes interventions are so self-satirizing that there's no need to say anything.
I thought you said that ad hominem was off the order paper today.
I'll put it back on.
You did start it actually earlier, talking about right-wing journalists working for the Times.
Well, they are right-wing journalists.
I wasn't going to mention this, but I did actually say to George earlier, please no ad hominem or ad feminem attacks today. But there we go. All right, so how should your...
That meant that Phil had nothing to say, by the way.
Let's just talk about how or whether Europe should respond to any of these threats. Now, Britain used to spend 2% of its GDP on defence. It no longer does, even under a Conservative government. We're all drawing in our horns because of the financial situation mainly. Is this a good idea? Can we just afford to say we don't need to defend ourselves to the degree that we used to? Is that safe, Bronwen?
I don't think it's just a matter of defence about how we respond. I think we as Europe most need to respond, we're talking about Putin, to the 3 Baltic states and to their concerns. Yes, they've got big Russian populations, some of whom might prefer to join Russia, some of whom might like to have a Russian passport as they're being offered, as well as the national passports. These are three countries that were part of the Soviet Union, not just the Soviet bloc, and their membership of the EU and NATO, which they have now, has been particularly provocative to Putin, as he expresses it. They're concerned now that if Russia moved or strengthened its control around their borders, that they would feel more cut off from Europe. Well, reasserting that they are part of EU and NATO and repeatedly doing so, I think is useful. But our response isn't just about defence. As I said, and I agree with Phil earlier that it also has to be about sorting out Europe's own ability to run itself, because that's part of its claim to be a part of the world that many people, as well as George, want to live in.
That fact that we're very attractive to people, which I agree, I agree, Europe is the best place in the world to live. I think that's true. And that has a magnetic attraction to many, many people. And one of the ways in which the world laps up on our shores is literally boats in the Mediterranean, the movement of people from places of conflict and disaster towards Europe. We cannot hope to think that Europe can somehow be isolated from the world in that sense. People are moving. Capital is always moving. The world economy is deeply integrated now, so the notion that we can somehow withdraw and think that we can live our own little life behind Fortress Europe, again, not true. It's not true politically, it's not true diplomatically. It's not true in the sense that there are those people who want to do us harm from time to time. The world is so deeply enmeshed that the idea that we can be isolationist, I think, is a fallacy, something we've lost. And I never quite understand, George, where you end up with your view. If you take all of your view, does it not lead to a kind of isolationist position, a sort of quietism? And I don't say that in order to be critical. It's a genuine inquiry. Isn't that the implication that the best response, if we take all of your views, is no response at all? Is to let the world be as it is, where it is, and for us to remain within our boundaries, quietly getting on with our life. Now, I'm asking you whether that's your position, not attributing it to you. But if it is, that just doesn't seem realistic in the world we live in.
Well, of course, this session is not about me or about my views. You're entitled to...
No, I'm interested. I'm genuinely, I'm interested.
That's what we're here for.
If you would like me to, I will, of course, say that actually nothing could be further from the truth. I'm not a pacifist, very far from it. I believe we have to defend ourselves. I think that the choice of a new generation of nuclear weapons and the submarines to platform them is a very bad choice in defense terms. I believe that we should defend our borders. We should defend our European borders. We should defend our British borders. We should organize ourselves so that our state and our states, collection of states, are a far more successful enterprise than they currently are. We have interests elsewhere. If anyone threatens our interests, we have a right to defend them. But that's not what we've been doing. When you go halfway around the world to invade another country and overthrow its government on a tower of lies, you're not defending your interests, you're imperiling your interests. As everyone, from the former head of MI5 to most sentient beings in the land, have already concluded that we actually damaged our own interests by invading and occupying Iraq. And it's not finished yet, not by a long chalk. So you asked me what I would do. I wouldn't do what you have already done, what you and the people that you supported have already done. And I said so at the time. The last conversation I ever had with Mr. Blair was this. The fall of Baghdad, 2 weeks before the war, the fall of Baghdad will not be the beginning of the end, merely the end of the beginning. Number two, there are no Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But if you and Bush invade and occupy it, there will be hundreds of thousands of Al-Qaeda. And not just in Iraq, but in our own countries. And I was right. I mean, at least have the grace to acknowledge that. I was right, and he was wrong.
You were right about that. So I'd like to thank Phil Collins very much, George Galloway, Bronwen Maddox, and all of you for your great questions.